really after about 5 years, this is where you can see the progression. And it only gets worse and gains momentum. That of course, it's not saying that after 5 years, you just lose your hair. That's not it. It's just after 5 years, typically, is when people see from therapy that, oh, it's not as great as it was. And the drugs work in the same way. But the problem is now there's a movement towards the last resort, which is Dutasteride. And this is a very problematic movement among young men. And they're trying to attain a silver bullet, that they think that by taking Dutasteride and getting their DHT down to the bare minimum, that hair loss will be stopped. It will go away. And of course, that is not what you want to do, because it will still be ongoing, because it's not all about DHT. We know that it's a primary culprit, but we don't fully understand hair loss. We don't understand the other mechanisms that are involved in it.
Okay, so the hair chemist really emphasizes and over-exaggerates the inevitability of hair loss. Now guys, look, in the previous section I already stated what you should do if you notice hair loss that is getting worse on finasteride, and that would be first to switch to dutasteride and get a damn scalp biopsy. And if you're already on dutasteride, then you definitely need to get that scalp biopsy right now. Because the data on continued hair loss on these drugs would suggest that you're either very, 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 very sensitive to DHT, or perhaps even more likely, you have another condition that is making your androgenetic alopecia worse, whether that's lichen planopilaris, whether that's some sort of seborrheic dermatitis, or if it's some sort of diffuse alopecia areata, or something like folliculitis decalvans, or even tinea capitis, also known as ringworm. And sorry for the abrupt voice change, I had to record this part again because there was a corruption in the audio and I just woke up, so. But yeah, let's get back to the other audio. A scalp biopsy, or even something called a KOH test or KOH wet test, these things can further what you might have. That being said, slowing down hair loss and offsetting it by anywhere from a decade to half a decade is good news, and that's on finasteride. We know that with the 5-year long-term Dutasteride study from South Korea, that Dutasteride tends to even work better. So it isn't uncommon for doctors to switch patients to Dutasteride or have Dutasteride be the starting therapy for men with androgenetic alopecia. I think it's likely that the hair chemist is referring to the 10-year long-term finasteride study on Italian men by Dr. Rossi et al. Because he claims that 5 years is the peaking effect while you're on these medications. Now, the data is a bit more complex from how he is presenting it. So let's look at it ourselves. At the end of the 10-year follow-up of the study, 24 patients, being 21%, showed further improvement, while 74 patients, being 65%, maintained their hair improvement. So they pretty much hit the peaking effect, but they didn't get any worse. So this means that a total of 98 patients, or 86%, experienced positive outcomes, whereas 15 patients, being 14%, showed worsened hair conditions. These 14% of patients showed a worsened hair condition compared to earlier assessments, which means their condition was worse than their baseline at the start of the study. They did not respond positively to treatment, or their hair condition deteriorated over the 10-year period. So maybe these patients could have been better on Dutasteride. Also, another important part about this study was that there were some people who, after 5 years, they still showed continuous improvement up to 10 years while being on the drug finasteride. But there were also some people who, after 5 years, experienced some minor decline in hair counts. However, they were still well above baseline. So what does that mean? That means at year 10 or at the end of the study, they were way better than they would have been at year 0 or the beginning of the study. And you can kind of make similar comparisons to the 10-year long-term Japanese study using finasteride, where they pretty much had the same conclusions, right? If you look at the graph on that particular study, you can see that there were times, where the hair count between the groups kind of fluctuated, but generally speaking, the trend was upward. And with factors of how early you took the drug in terms of your normal progression and one compared to baseline, they were just better off, right? So that does conclusively state that you're going to get benefits if you have androgenetic alopecia when you use finasteride, and even better, Dutasteride. But again, I do have to question how many of these people that didn't respond well to finasteride actually only had androgenetic alopecia and nothing else, like lichen planopilaris, maybe seborrheic dermatitis, or some form of chronic folliculitis decalvans. How many of these people in this study were biopsied at various points to only confirm whether or not they just had androgenetic alopecia? But I think that's something to entertain seriously, considering how the biopsies and the statistics concerning them seem to be very biased, such that we're not getting a good idea when it comes to how many people are truly affected by this condition, because we're so focused on postmenopausal women due to notions that, well, women can't have hair loss, or it's very unusual for them to have hair loss, so when a woman comes to our clinic with hair loss, we tend to have a preference of biopsying her because it could be indicative of another condition that's more serious. Because, and of course, we already know this, they weren't biopsied, it wasn't stated in the study at all. But if they were biopsied, maybe it could have told us that the people that don't respond well are people that also have adjacent or just other conditions that affect their hair follicles. You know, it was hair chemists that did say that these studies often don't reflect the real-world clinical setting, and that's true. That sort of external validity that I talked about earlier in one of the previous segments. So taking that into consideration, hopefully Dr. Paresis does scalp biopsies of his hair transplant clients, or maybe he can recommend his clients to dermatologists that understand pathologies of the skin, and hopefully hair chemists can start actually looking at studies and not just, dismissing them all around due to that sort of external validity, whatever. Because maybe the external validity kind of becomes a fallacy at some point.
Reality, because the clinical setting can often yield a different data set compared to a study that had 100 men. And there's no point going into the different parameters and all of this, but what we do know is hair loss is a progressive condition. And
he manipulated you again? Why would he manipulate you? Why would he do that? Did you give in? No!